What if I told you that the next war didn't begin with a declaration, but with a whisper in a war room? Before the missiles lit up the night sky, before the headlines screamed a retaliation, there were quiet decisions, calculated, deliberate, and irreversible. For decades, the United States, Israel, and Iran fought a shadow war of spies, cyber attacks, sanctions, and secrets. Then one night, the shadows disappeared. How did we get here? Who made the call? And what does this confrontation mean for the future of the Middle East and the world? Stay with me, because this is not just a story about strategy and power. It's a story about history unfolding in real time. We'll explain everything in this video, step by step. Don't skip it. Picture the world watching in the early dawn of February 28, 2026. Sirens wailing across capitals, families clutching breakfast cups, and a quiet disbelief settling into the hearts of millions. Ladies and gentlemen, today we stand at a crossroads in human history, a moment when the age-old narratives of power, fear, pride, and hope converged with overwhelming force. For decades, the narrative between the United States, Israel, and Iran was defined by suspicion and strategic calculus, clandestine operations, whispered negotiations, and near misses that never quite broke into full daylight. Tehran's nuclear ambitions, its ballistic missiles, and its network of regional alliances cast an ever-lengthening shadow over Middle Eastern geopolitics. Jerusalem perceived an existential threat, and Washington oscillated between diplomacy and deterrence. But on a cold February morning in 2026, the world changed. In a coordinated military offensive, called Operation Epic Fury by the United States and Operation Roaring Lion by Israel, American and Israeli air forces launched strikes across Iranian territory. Fighter jets cleaved through pre-dawn skies, missiles thundered into command centers, and explosions lit up cities from Tehran to Isfahan, Karaj to Qom. A vast, terrifying sweep of violence meant to reshape reality itself. This was not a distant skirmish. This was a full-scale attempt not just to degrade military capacity, but to upend a nation. In the strikes that followed, Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei was killed along with other senior commanders, a seismic event in the life of a nation and a turning point in the history of a region. President Donald Trump described the operation as necessary to destroy missile programs and prevent a future nuclear capability, a mission he believed could avert a catastrophe yet unseen. Israeli leaders spoke in terms of eliminating an existential threat to their very survival. But let us pause, for history is not just measured in missions and missiles, but in faces, homes, and hearts. In Tehran, a mother shielded her child from the roar of incoming strikes. In Isfahan, sons and daughters looked to the sky, unaware that the world's great powers had chosen that very moment to redraw the map of their lives. In cities across the Middle East and beyond, protesters surged into the streets, some in grief, others in outrage. And then came the retaliation. Iran's response was swift and sweeping. Missiles and drones fired toward Israel and U.S. bases across the Gulf. The conflict expanded, entangling nations and raising fears of a wider war that could sweep across continents. A war not declared by any parliament, nor sanctioned by the United Nations, now raged with a ferocity not seen in years, shaking oil markets, disrupting trade routes like the vital Strait of Hormuz, and forcing every leader on the world stage to ask, what price peace? There are those who will say this was strategic necessity, that to confront a threat before it fully emerges is the duty of responsible statesmanship. And there are others who cry foul, seeing in this episode an echo of old imperial impulses. A powerful alliance imposing its will on a sovereign nation, unraveling decades of diplomacy and stoking deep resentment across the global south. History will judge this moment with the clarity only time can grant. But history, real history, does not forget the faces etched with fear in Tehran neighborhoods, or the empty teaching chairs where bright young students once sat. It does not forget the parents in the Gulf who whispered prayers as air raid sirens screamed, and it does not forget that every conflict, no matter how justified in the language of strategy, is ultimately paid for in the currency of human life. Two nations launched an attack, and the world watched, not as spectators, but as witnesses. For history is not a ledger of power alone. It is a tapestry of the human spirit woven with threads of hope, sorrow, courage, and consequence. And as we recount this chapter of our shared story, let us remember, when great powers wage war, it is not only borders that are redrawn, but hearts and histories as well. If you found stillness in these words, subscribe to join this space of presence, and share your deepest now in the comments below. In 1979, when the streets of Tehran filled with chants against a monarch and a revolution swept away a throne that had stood for decades, few could have imagined that the aftershocks would reverberate across generations. The fall of the Shah and the rise of the Islamic Republic under Ruhollah Khomeini did not merely change Iran's internal order, it reshaped the geometry of power in the Middle East. For the United States, which had long supported the Shah as a pillar of stability, the revolution felt like the sudden closing of a door that had once stood wide open. For Israel, it marked the emergence of a government that spoke openly of resistance and defiance, framing its foreign policy in the language of ideology and faith. The rupture deepened when militants stormed the American embassy in Tehran, holding diplomats hostage for 444 days. In living rooms across the United States, nightly news broadcasts transformed a distant capital into a symbol of humiliation and anger. In Tehran, the crisis hardened attitudes, convincing many that confrontation with Washington was not only inevitable, but necessary. Distrust, once seeded, took root and grew thick with every passing year. The 1980s brought war between Iran and Iraq, a conflict so brutal it consumed hundreds of thousands of lives. The United States, wary of revolutionary fervor spreading across the region, tilted toward Baghdad. In the Persian Gulf, American naval vessels and Iranian forces circled one another in tense encounters that sometimes erupted into violence. The accidental downing of Iran, Air Flight 655, by a USS Force. Warship in 1988 added another scar to a relationship already defined by suspicion. Each tragedy etched new lines into collective memory, reinforcing narratives of grievance on both sides. For Israel, the concern centered not only on rhetoric but on alliances. As Iran extended support to groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza, Israeli leaders saw an encirclement strategy taking shape. Rockets fired from southern Lebanon or the Gaza Strip were not viewed as isolated incidents. They were perceived as echoes of decisions made in Tehran. Iran, in turn, described its support as solidarity with movements resisting occupation and injustice. Thus, what one side framed as deterrence, the other experienced as aggression. The turn of the millennium ushered in new arenas of conflict, quiet, invisible, and often denied. Cyber warfare emerged as a tool of modern statecraft. In 2010, a sophisticated computer worm known as Stuxnet infiltrated Iranian nuclear facilities, reportedly disrupting centrifuges at Natanz. Though official acknowledgments were scarce, the operation was widely attributed to cooperation between the United States and Israel. It marked a new chapter in shadow warfare, where lines of code replaced bombs and sabotage unfolded in silence rather than flame. For Iranian scientists arriving at work to find their systems compromised, it was a reminder that battlefields had migrated into laboratories and server rooms. Sanctions became another instrument in this long contest. Layer upon layer of economic restrictions targeted Iran's banking sector, oil exports, and access to global markets. In Washington, policymakers argued that sanctions offered a peaceful means of pressure, a way to compel negotiation without firing a shot. In Tehran, the measures were experienced as collective punishment, tightening the grip of inflation and unemployment on ordinary citizens. Shopkeepers, factory workers, and students felt the squeeze of decisions made thousands of miles away. The debate over efficacy and morality raged in think tanks and parliaments, but in Iranian households, the consequences were immediate and personal. Yet even amid hostility, diplomacy flickered. Negotiators gathered in European capitals, seeking common ground over Iran's nuclear program. The resulting agreement in 2015, formally known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, represented a rare moment of cautious optimism. Inspectors gained access to facilities. Centrifuges were dismantled. Sanctions were eased. For a brief period, it seemed possible that decades of animosity might yield to pragmatic coexistence. Families in Tehran hoped for economic renewal. Policymakers in Washington spoke of verification and trust, however, limited. But trust proved fragile. In 2018, the United States withdrew from the agreement, reimposing sanctions in a policy described as maximum pressure. Iran responded by gradually exceeding some of the deal's limits, enriching uranium beyond agreed thresholds. The cycle of action and reaction resumed, each step justified as defensive, each perceived by the other as provocation. European allies struggled to preserve the accord, while regional tensions mounted. The rivalry extended beyond borders into the fractured landscapes of Syria and Iraq. In Syria's civil war, Iran backed the government of Bashar al-Assad. deploying advisors and mobilizing allied militias. Israel, determined to prevent advanced weapons from reaching Hezbollah, conducted airstrikes against Iranian-linked targets inside Syria. These strikes, often unacknowledged publicly, formed a steady drumbeat of confrontation, jets crossing airspace under cover of darkness, missiles striking warehouses and convoys. Each operation carried the risk of escalation, yet both sides calibrated their responses carefully, seeking advantage without triggering full-scale war. In Iraq, the presence of American troops and Iranian-backed militias created a volatile mix. The killing of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani in a U.S. drone strike in 2020 brought tensions to a fever pitch. For many Iranians, Soleimani was a national hero, a figure associated with the fight against extremist groups. For American officials, he was the architect of attacks that had cost American lives. His death spark led massive funeral processions in Iran and retaliatory missile strikes against U.S. bases in Iraq. The world watched anxiously as leaders weighed their next moves, aware that miscalculation could ignite a broader conflagration. Throughout these decades, rhetoric often soared to apocalyptic heights. Iranian leaders denounced American interference in Israeli policies. Israeli officials warned that a nuclear-armed Iran would pose an existential threat. American presidents alternated between calls for regime change and invitations to negotiate. Speeches at the United Nations, military parades in Tehran, and security conferences in Jerusalem all reinforced narratives of vigilance and resolve. Public opinion hardened, shaped by memories of past wounds and fears of future danger. And beneath it all, intelligence agencies operated in the shadows. Reports surfaced of targeted assassinations of Iranian nuclear scientists, mysterious explosions at military sites, and covert operations aimed at gathering secrets or delaying technological progress. Iranian authorities blamed foreign adversaries. Israel maintained strategic ambiguity. The United States spoke carefully, if at all. The fog of deniability cloaked actions that nonetheless reverberated loudly within Iran's scientific and security communities. For ordinary citizens, this prolonged shadow conflict formed the backdrop of daily life. A generation of Iranians grew up under sanctions, accustomed to shortages and currency fluctuations. Israeli families practiced drills in case of rocket fire from proxy forces. American service members rotated through bases in the Gulf, aware that unseen drones or missiles might one day arc toward their installations. The contest was not a single war, but a sustained condition of tension, sometimes flaring, sometimes receding, never fully resolved. The story of how the United States and Israel came to strike Iran cannot be understood without tracing this long arc of distrust and confrontation. It is a history written not only in treaties and troop movements, but in whispered fears and hardened convictions, encoded malware and clandestine meetings, in speeches that stirred crowds, and in sanctions that tightened household budgets, in drone flights over desert landscapes, and in negotiations conducted behind closed doors, where translators weighed every word with care. If you found stillness in these words, subscribe to join this space of presence and share your deepest now in the comments below. The nuclear question did not begin with the centrifuge spinning in the desert. It began decades earlier, in an era when Iran was still ruled by a monarch and the promise of atomic energy was wrapped in the language of modernity and progress. In the 1950s, under the American-led Atoms for Peace initiative, Washington encouraged Tehran to explore civilian nuclear technology. Laboratories were built, scientists were trained, and reactors were supplied with Western support. The irony of history would later hang heavy over these early partnerships, for what was once cooperation would evolve into confrontation. After the 1979 revolution, suspicion replaced collaboration. The new Islamic Republic, forged in defiance of Western influence, inherited the infrastructure of a nuclear program, but faced isolation and war. When conflict with Iraq consumed the 1980s, Iranian leaders came to view self-reliance in defense and technology as essential to survival. Though Tehran consistently insisted its nuclear ambitions were peaceful, the opacity surrounding certain facilities fed unease abroad. In intelligence briefings in Washington and Jerusalem, analysts studied satellite images and procurement networks, searching for clues in shipments of aluminum tubes or the layout of underground bunkers. By the early 2000s, revelations about undeclared sites intensified global concern. Facilities at Natanz in Iraq, once obscure names on a map, became symbols of a looming crisis. The International Atomic Energy Agency pressed for access and transparency, and inspectors walked through halls lined with centrifuges, counting machines designed to enrich uranium. Enrichment itself is not forbidden under international law for peaceful purposes, but the same process that fuels a power plant can at higher levels provide material for a weapon. It is this dual-use nature that lies at the heart of the nuclear question. Technology balanced precariously between light and fire. For Israel, the calculus was existential. Leaders across the political spectrum spoke of the lessons of history of a small nation born in the aftermath of catastrophe, unwilling to gamble its survival on promises alone. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu stood before international audiences with diagrams and warnings, arguing that a nuclear-armed Iran would alter the balance of power irrevocably. In Jerusalem's security circles, the fear was not merely theoretical. It was framed as a matter of national life and death. In Washington, perspective shifted with administrations but shared a common thread of anxiety. President Barack Obama pursued diplomacy, believing that rigorous inspections and negotiated limits could constrain Iran's program. The result was the 2015 nuclear agreement, formerly known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Under its terms, Iran agreed to reduce its stockpile of enriched uranium, limit enrichment levels, redesign reactors, and submit to an intrusive inspection regime. In return, sanctions that had crippled its economy would be lifted in phases. For a moment, the agreement represented a fragile bridge over decades of mistrust. Inspectors reported compliance, centrifuges were dismantled, and oil once again flowed more freely into global markets. Iranian families felt a cautious optimism as inflation eased and foreign companies explored opportunities. In Europe, diplomats hailed the accord as proof that dialogue could succeed where threats had failed. Yet skepticism endured. Critics in the United States and Israel argued that the deal postponed rather than eliminated the risk, pointing to sunset clauses that would eventually lift certain restrictions. They warned that regional activities, support for allied militias, ballistic missile development, remained untouched. The debate was fierce, echoing through congressional hearings and election campaigns. When President Donald Trump withdrew the United States from the agreement in 2018, the bridge collapsed. Sanctions returned with renewed intensity under a policy labeled maximum pressure, oil exports ply. Sanctions plunged the national currency lost value, and economic hardship deepened across Iran. In response, Tehran gradually reduced its compliance with the accord, enriching uranium beyond previously agreed limits and installing more advanced centrifuges. Each step was presented as reversible, contingent on sanctions relief, yet each also narrowed the distance between civilian capacity and potential weaponization. Meanwhile, the scientific race continued. Reports emerged of enrichment levels approaching thresholds that alarmed Western intelligence agencies. Discussions of breakout time, the period required to produce enough fissile material for a bomb, moved from abstract calculation to urgent headline. For Israeli planners, the narrowing window intensified calls for decisive action. In private meetings and public speeches, the argument hardened. If diplomacy could not guarantee security, other measures might be necessary. Security, other measures might be necessary. Covert efforts sought to slow progress. Cyber operations, widely attributed to U.S. and Israeli cooperation, targeted nuclear infrastructure. The computer worm Stuxnet disrupted centrifuges at Natanz, reportedly causing them to spin out of control while feeding false data to monitors. Explosions at facilities and the assassinations of nuclear scientists added layers of tension. Iran blamed foreign adversaries, vowing resilience and retaliation. The shadow war that had simmered for years intensified around the nuclear core. Diplomatic efforts flickered again in indirect talks aimed at restoring the agreement. Negotiators shuttled between capitals, parsing technical language and sequencing steps. Who would lift which sanctions first? Who would verify compliance? How to address advanced centrifuges installed after the U.S. withdrawal? Trust, however, proved elusive. Domestic politics in all involved nations constrained flexibility. In Tehran, hardliners questioned the wisdom of engaging with a partner that had already abandoned a signed accord. In Washington, skepticism about Iran's regional behavior complicated compromise. In Israel, leaders watched warily, fearing that time was slipping away. Beyond policy rooms, the nuclear question seeped into the consciousness of ordinary people. In Iranian universities, students of physics and engineering pursued research under the weight of geopolitical scrutiny, aware that their work was entangled in global controversy. In Israeli cities, families listened to news updates about enrichment leak. Vels as if tracking an approaching storm. In the United States, veterans of earlier Middle Eastern wars wondered whether another conflict loomed on the horizon. The debate over Iran's intentions remained fiercely contested. Iranian officials insisted their program was peaceful, rooted in a sovereign right to energy independence and scientific advancement. They cited religious decrees against nuclear weapons and pointed to inspections that had found no definitive proof of weaponization. Critics countered that secrecy, advanced centrifuge development, and enrichment at higher levels signaled preparation for a potential weapons option. The ambiguity itself became a strategic tool, with each side interpreting signals through the lens of its own fears. As enrichment levels rose and inspection disputes multiplied, the margin for error narrowed. Military planners in Israel reportedly refined contingency options for strikes on nuclear facilities. American officials reiterated commitments to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon, emphasizing that all options remained on the table. The rhetoric carried a familiar cadence, echoing warnings from previous decades, yet infused with new urgency. Thus, the nuclear question evolved from a technical dispute into a crucible of national identity and regional power. It entwined scientific ambition with historical trauma, sovereign rights with collective security, diplomacy with deterrence. It became the axis around which decades of mistrust revolved, a single issue capable of igniting confrontation or inspiring cautious cooperation, a question that hovered over negotiations and military briefings alike, shaping calculations in Tehran, Jerusalem, and Washington, pressing leaders toward decisions that would reverberate far beyond the walls of any reactor hall. If you found stillness in these words, subscribe to join the space of Preseri. Isn't and share you deepest now in the comments below. War, when it finally steps out of the shadows, does not begin with the sound of explosions. It begins in rooms without windows, under fluorescent lights where maps glow on digital screens and men and women speak in measured tones about distances, fuel ranges, radar envelopes, and the quiet arithmetic of risk. The strike itself, when the United States and Israel chose to move from covert pressure to open force, was the culmination of years of preparation, contingency planning, and intelligence gathering that unfolded far from public view. In Israel, planners within the Israel Defense Forces had long studied the geography of Iran's nuclear and military infrastructure. Facilities were dispersed, some buried deep underground, shielded by mountains or reinforced concrete. The challenge was not only distance, over 1,000 miles of hostile or uncertain airspace, but complexity. Any operation would require precision, coordination, and the element of surprise. Israeli pilots trained for long-range missions, rehearsing refueling procedures in midair and simulating strikes against fortified targets. They understood that the margin for error would be thin and that regional retaliation could follow swiftly. Across the ocean within the United States Department of Defense, similar plans existed in varying degrees of detail. American military capabilities, stealth bombers, cruise missiles, carrier strike groups offered reach and firepower that could complement Israeli resolve. Yet American involvement carried its own gravity. A direct strike on Iranian soil risked igniting a broader regional war, drawing in Gulf states, threatening shipping lanes, and endangering thousands of USS personnel stationed across the Middle East. The decision, therefore, was not merely tactical. It was strategic and political, weighted with global consequence. The intelligence picture shaped every calculation. Satellites traced construction at nuclear sites, intertested communications, hinted at technical advances, and human sources provided fragments of insight into internal deliberations. Analysts debated enrichment levels, breakout timelines, and the placement of air defense systems. Iranian radar networks, missile batteries, and fighter squadrons were mapped in detail. The goal was not only to strike but to suppress, to blind and disorient long enough to complete the mission and withdraw. When the moment came, it unfolded with choreographed precision. Stealth aircraft lifted off under cover of darkness, their contours designed to evade detection. Refueling tankers orbited in predetermined corridors, extending the operational reach of strike packages. Naval assets positioned in strategic waters prepared to launch cruise missiles capable of traveling hundreds of miles with pinpoint accuracy. Electronic warfare units stood ready to jam radar signals and disrupt communications, creating pockets of confusion in the opening minutes. Israeli aircraft, including advanced fighters such as the F-35 Lightning II, reportedly played a central role in penetrating Iranian airspace. Their low observable profiles allowed them to approach critical targets with reduced risk of interception. Precision-guided munitions were selected not for spectacle, but for effect, designed to destroy centrifuge halls, disable power supplies, and crater runways without unnecessary collateral damage. American platforms, potentially including long-range bombers, like the B-2 Spirit, provided the capacity to strike deeply buried facilities with specialized ordnance engineered to penetrate reinforced structures. The first impacts were intended to neutralize air defenses. Radar installations and surface-to-air missile sites were targety. Danacled clear pathways for follow-on waves. And military doctrine suppression of enemy air defenses is a prerequisite for sustained operations. By degrading Iran's ability to track and respond, planners sought to compress the timeline of engagement, limiting opportunities for counterstrike during the critical opening hours. Communication between Allied forces was constant, encrypted, and tightly controlled. Command centers monitored real-time feeds from drones and satellites, adjusting flight paths as needed. Each pilot carried not only munitions, but a mental map of contingency options, alternate targets, emergency landing sites, abort protocols. The choreography required trust, built over years of joint exercises and intelligence sharing. It was a demonstration of interoperability as much as force. On the ground in Iran, the experience was immediate and disorienting. Sirens wailed in some areas. In others, explosions came without warning. Military personnel rushed to stations attempting to assess damage and coordinate response. Power flickered in targeted zones. Smoke rose from facilities that had been symbols of national pride and scientific ambition. For civilians living nearby, the distinction between military and political objectives blurred in the face of shock and fear. Strategically, the strike aimed to achieve multiple objectives simultaneously: delay or dismantle elements of the nuclear program, signal resolve to regional adversaries, and reassert deterrence. Proponents argued that a decisive blow could reset calculations in Tehran, demonstrating that continued escalation would carry tangible cost. Critics warned that even the most precise operation might strengthen hardliners, unify public opinion against foreign intervention, and accelerate clandestine efforts. The regional dimension loomed large. U.S. bases in the Gulf were placed on heightened alert and sea, anticipating potential retaliation. Naval vessels adjusted defensive postures, prepared for missile or drone attacks. Israel activated civil defense systems, including missile interceptors designed to counter incoming threats from multiple directions. Diplomats in Allied capitals worked phones through the night, briefing counterparts and urging restraint where possible. Technology played a defining role. Precision-guided munitions relied on satellite navigation and laser designation. Cyber components may have accompanied kinetic strikes, seeking to disrupt command and control networks or disable key systems. The integration of cyber and conventional force reflected a modern doctrine in which battlefields extend beyond physical terrain into digital space. Yet for all the sophistication, the operation rested on human judgment. Leaders weighed intelligence assessments, military recommendations, and political ramifications. Pilots made split-second decisions under pressure. Analysts interpreted data streams in real time, distinguishing between confirmed destruction and misleading signals. The strike was not an abstraction, it was a series of choices executed by individuals who understood the stakes. International reaction followed swiftly. Some governments expressed concern about escalation and called for de-escalation. Others reiterated support for preventing nuclear proliferation. Markets reacted to uncertainty, oil prices fluctuating as traders assessed risks to supply routes. The strike, though geographically concentrated, reverberated globally, reminding distant capitals that events in one region can unsettle the entire international system. In the hours that followed, battle damage assessments began. Imagery was scrutinized for signs of structural collapse or secondary explosions. Officials measured success not in dramatic footage, but in disrupted capabilities and delayed timelines. Yet even as assessments continued, attention shifted to what might come next. How Iran would respond, whether proxies would act, how long deterrence might hold. The strike itself was thus both culmination and commencement, the endpoint of years of shadow conflict and the beginning of a more overt phase. It reflected a belief among decision-makers that the risks of inaction had surpassed the dangers of action. That deterrence required demonstration, that credibility once tested must be reaffirmed through force, a calculation forged in intelligence briefings and strategic debates, translated into flight plans and launch codes. carried across darkened skies by aircraft whose silhouettes barely registered against the horizon, converging on targets chosen not only for their physical significance, but for the message they were meant to send. Retaliation, when it comes, is rarely abstract. It carries the weight of wounded pride, national memory, and the unyielding demand to answer force with force. In the hours after the strike, as smoke still drifted above targeted facilities and officials in Washington and Jerusalem assessed their objectives, as elections in Washington and Jerusalem assessed their objectives, leaders in Tehran faced a question that has haunted nations throughout history: how to respond in a way that restores deterrence without inviting annihilation. Iran's military doctrine had long anticipated such a moment. Over decades of sanctions and isolation, it invested not only in conventional forces, but in asymmetric capabilities, ballistic missiles, drones, and a network of allied groups across the region. These assets were not incidental. They were designed precisely to complicate the calculations of adversaries with superior air power. Within command centers beneath Tehran, officers of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps weighed options measured in range, payload, and political symbolism. Missiles were among. The first instruments of reply, launched from concealed sites, they arched across night skies toward targets associated with the initial strike, military installations, intelligence facilities, and strategic infrastructure. Some were intercepted by layered defense systems. Others found their mark, igniting fires and sending plumes of smoke upward as proof that Iran's reach extended beyond its borders. The exchange transformed a one-sided operation into a visible duel, each side testing the other's thresholds. Drones followed, smaller and less predictable. Swarms of unmanned aircraft complicated air defense systems, forcing radar operators to distinguish between decoys and genuine threats. The use of drones symbolized a new era of warfare in which relatively inexpensive platforms could challenge advanced militaries. The psychological effect was as potent as the physical damage. Sirens sounded in Israeli cities, and families sought shelter in reinforced rooms, listening to the distant thud of interceptors meeting incoming projectiles. Beyond direct strikes, Iran's regional alliances stirred. In Lebanon, Hezbollah signaled readiness, its rocket arsenal serving as a latent second front. In Iraq and Syria, militias aligned with Tehran assessed their own capacity to target U.S. personnel and facilities. The geography of conflict widened, stretching from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf. American commanders elevated alert levels at bases across the region, aware that retaliation might come not only from Iran itself, but through partners bound by ideology and shared grievance. The Strait of Hormuz emerged as another focal point. This narrow waterway, through which a significant portion of the world's oil supply passes, has long been a strategic lever for Tehran. Naval maneuvers increased and commercial vessels adjusted routes amid reports of heightened tension. In Syria, next rates for shipping climbed, reflecting the fear that even a minor incident could disrupt global energy markets. Traders in distant financial centers watched screens flicker with volatile prices, their fortunes tied to events unfolding thousands of miles away. Diplomacy did not fall silent, but it shifted in tone. Emergency sessions convened at the United Nations Security Council, where ambassadors spoke in measured phrases about sovereignty, restraint, and the imperative to avoid further escalation. Some nations condemned the initial strike as a violation of international norms. Others emphasized the need to prevent nuclear proliferation. The Chamber's debates reflected the broader fragmentation of global consensus, with alliances and rivalries shaping each statement. In Washington, officials framed Iran's response as confirmation of the threat they had sought to neutralize. They pointed to missile launches as evidence of destabilizing intent. In Tehran, leaders portrayed retaliation as a sovereign right, a defense of national dignity against foreign aggression. State media broadcast images of launch crews and flag-draped coffins, reinforcing narratives of sacrifice and resistance. Public rallies blended grief with defiance, crowds chanting slogans that echoed through city squares. Israel, accustomed to living under the shadow of rockets, activated its multi-layered defense systems. Interceptors streaked upward to meet incoming threats, their flashes illuminating night skies. The government emphasized resilience, urging citizens to follow safety protocols while projecting confidence in its protective capabilities. Beneath official statements lay an awareness that sustained exchanges could strain even the most advanced systems. Cyber operations intensified alongside physical strikes. Government websites flickered offline, financial networks flickered through. PNs and misinformation campaigns proliferated across social media platforms. Each side sought advantage not only in territory but in narrative, aiming to shape international perception and domestic morale. The battlefield extended into digital space, where attribution is murky and consequences ripple unpredictably. Regional powers face delicate choices. Gulf states, hosting American forces yet wary of becoming targets, navigated a narrow path between alliance and self-preservation. European governments called for immediate de-escalation, dispatching envoys to capitals in hopes of reopening channels of communication. Russia and China monitored developments closely, calculating how shifting dynamics might affect their own strategic interests. For civilians across the region, the shockwaves were deeply personal. In southern Lebanon, families stocked supplies amid fears of renewed cross-border conflict. In Iraqi cities near U.S. installations, residents worried that their neighborhoods might become battlegrounds for forces beyond their control. In Iran, air raid drills returned to prominence, echoing memories of past wars. In Israel, children practiced shelter protocols in schools, their routines shaped by distant decisions. Markets reacted with nervous urgency. Oil prices surged on fears of supply disruption, influencing transportation costs and economic forecasts worldwide. Airlines rerouted flights to avoid contested airspace. Investors sought safe havens, reflecting a broader anxiety that a regional clash could spiral into something far larger. The interconnectedness of the modern world meant that missiles launched in one region could unsettle livelihoods in another. Military strategists assessed the balance of escalation, the concept of proportionality, responding firmly yet without crossing thresholds that would trigger overwhelming retaliation, guided Dalib. Rations. Yet proportionality is not a precise science. It is an art shaped by perception as much as by fact. A strike deemed limited by one side may be perceived as intolerable by the other. Misinterpretation in such a climate becomes a constant risk. Back-channel communications reportedly flickered into action. Even adversaries often maintain quiet lines to prevent miscalculation. Messages conveyed through intermediaries signaled intentions and red lines, attempting to draw invisible boundaries around visible violence. These communications did not erase hostility, but they aimed to prevent chaos from overtaking calculation. As days passed, the region held its breath, uncertain whether the exchange would settle into uneasy deterrence or cascade into broader war. Each missile launch, each intercepted drone, each speech by a national leader carried implications beyond immediate damage. The shockwaves were not confined to cratered runways or shattered windows. They reverberated through alliances, economies, and collective memory, reshaping perceptions of strength and vulnerability. Compelling governments and citizens alike to confront the fragile equilibrium upon which their security had long depended. In the aftermath of missiles and speeches, of satellite images and security briefings, what lingers longest is not the echo of jets in the sky, but the quiet transformation of human lives. The human and historical cost of confrontation between the United States, Israel, and Iran cannot be measured solely in damaged facilities or disrupted supply chains. It is measured in the subtle, enduring shifts in memory, identity, and trust that shape generations. In Tehran, the strike and its retaliation entered the national narrative with solemn gravity. State television replayed images of smoke rising from targeted sites, while funerals for fallen personnel unfolded beneath banners of martyrdom. Mothers stood beside framed photographs of sons in uniform, their grief braided with pride and anger. For many Iranians, the attack reinforced a story long told, that their nation exists under perpetual threat from powerful adversaries. Children who had known sanctions as an economic reality now came to know sirens as well, absorbing a lesson about vulnerability before they could fully understand geopolitics. In Israel, families accustomed to tension found themselves once again counting seconds between warning alarms and interception blasts. The whir of defensive systems overhead offered reassurance, yet it also underscored the precariousness of security. Parents explained to their children why school schedules changed and why shelters mattered. The language of deterrence, so common in policy circles, translated into bedtime conversations about safety and resilience. A society built in the shadow of past catastrophe confronted anew the fragility of its present calm. In the United States, the conflict felt distant to some and deeply personal to others. Service members stationed across the Middle East monitored developments with heightened alert, aware that retaliation might reach their bases. Families at home refreshed news feeds, measuring time by headlines. Veterans of earlier wars sensed a familiar tightening in the national mood, recalling how quickly limited engagements can expand beyond their initial scope. Public debate revived old questions about intervention, sovereignty, and the limits of power. The economic cost unfolded quietly but relentlessly. Sanctions intensified and countermeasures followed, constricting trade and investment. Inflation pressed harder on Iranian households, already strained by years of restriction. Medicines grew scarce, prices climbed, and young graduates faced uncertain futures. In Israel and the Gulf states, markets reacted to each escalation with nervous volatility. Globally, energy prices fluctuated as traders weighed risks to shipping lanes. The architecture of globalization revealed its sensitivity to regional shock, reminding distant populations that conflict anywhere can reverberate everywhere. Diplomatically, alliances shifted in subtle ways. Some nations condemned the strike as a breach of international norms, while others framed it as a necessary measure against proliferation. The debate exposed fractures within long-standing partnerships. European governments struggled to balance security concerns with commitments to multilateral agreements. Regional actors recalibrated their positions, gauging whether alignment or distance would better serve their interests in a world where great powers once again appeared willing to act unilaterally. The credibility of international institutions absorbed its own blow. At the United Nations, calls for restraint and dialogue echoed through assembly halls, yet enforcement mechanisms seemed limited against the force of sovereign decisions. The gap between rhetoric and reality widened, feeding skepticism among populations who already questioned the effectiveness of global governance. When powerful states act outside consensus, smaller nations watch closely, recalculating their own security assumptions. Within Iran, the political landscape evolved under pressure. Hardline voices argued that compromise had yielded vulnerability, that trust in Western agreements had been misplaced. Reformist elements found themselves constrained, their calls for engagement overshadowed by demands for strength. National unity surged in moments of crisis, but unity forged in fear can carry long-term implications for civil liberties and political openness. The balance between security and freedom tilted, as it so often does in times of perceived siege. In Israel, the strike reinforced a doctrine that has shaped its history, that preemption, when deemed necessary, is preferable to waiting for threat to mature. Yet such doctrine carries ethical weight. Debates resurfaced about proportionality, civilian risk, and the moral calculus of preventive action. In a democracy accustomed to robust internal discourse, voices of support and dissent alike wrestled with the consequences of force. The memory of past wars informed present judgment, reminding citizens that tactical success does not erase strategic complexity. In the United States, lawmakers and commentators revisited fundamental questions about executive authority and congressional oversight. The constitutional balance of war powers, often blurred in modern conflicts, came under renewed scrutiny. Citizens weighed security assurances against concerns about escalation. The long arc of American involvement in the Middle East formed the backdrop to these debates, a tapestry woven from interventions, alliances, and unintended outcomes. Beyond policy and politics, the human cost manifested in quieter ways. Students in Iranian universities saw research projects delayed or disrupted, their aspirations entangled with sanctions and suspicion. Israeli entrepreneurs calculated the risk of regional instability on investment decisions. American families with roots in the Middle East navigated dual loyalties and complicated conversations. Diaspora communities felt the pull of distant homelands, their identities shaped by events beyond their control. History, too, absorbed the moment. Future scholars will trace the lineage of this confrontation back through decades of mistrust, through the revolution that redefined Iran's identity, through proxy conflicts and diplomatic breakthroughs, through assassinations and agreements. They will examine how technological advances, from Cyber 2 to precision munitions, altered the calculus of war. They will ask whether the strike delayed a threat, accelerated it, or transformed it into something less visible but no less potent. The moral dimension lingers longest. Every missile carries not only explosive force but ethical consequence. Leaders justify actions in the language of necessity and defense, yet each decision shakes the lives of individuals who never sat at negotiation tables, or inside at negotiation tables, or inside command centers. A shopkeeper in Tehran, a teacher in Tel Aviv, a Marine in Bahrain. All inherit the outcome of choices made by others. The abstraction of strategy dissolves in the immediacy of lived experience. Memory hardens over time. Children who hear stories of attack and retaliation grow into adults who vote, serve, and lead. Narratives of grievance or survival become embedded in textbooks and commemorations. The risk is not only physical escalation, but psychological entrenchment. a future defined by the assumption that conflict is inevitable. Yet history also records moments when adversaries step back from the brink, when fatigue with confrontation opens space for recalibration. The human and historical cost, then, is not confined to the present tense. It extends forward into classrooms and parliaments, into cultural expression and private reflection. It shapes how nations perceive one another and how citizens understand their place in a turbulent world. It alters alliances and redraws assumptions about deterrence and diplomacy. It lingers in photographs framed on mantels and in archives consulted decades later, a reminder that power exercised in a moment can echo across generations, imprinting itself upon the conscience of nations and the fragile fabric of international order. If you found stillness in these words, subscribe to join the space of presence and share you deepest now in the comments below. Subscripts, thanks for watching this video and don't forget to like and dan.